In August 2003, a combination of transmission line outages and communications failures in the Midwest led to one of the largest blackouts in U.S. history, plunging much of the eastern seaboard into darkness.
It certainly caught New Yorkers by surprise. Events or actions were taken well outside of New York's control or New York's awareness and resulted in a cascading type blackout event that eventually resulted in most of New York being without power. And it was extraordinary, the magnitude and again the cost and the concern of how this could happen.
The New York Independent System Operator, responsible for balancing electric load with supply and maintaining reliability of the transmission system, any large-scale outage is the worst-case scenario. This is Episode 3, Keeping the Lights On. In Episode 3, we look at lessons learned from past outages and steps we're taking at the New York ISO to prevent future outages as we move to a zero-emissions grid by 2040. The New York ISO was established in 1999, but the company's history stretches back to the late 1960s, when our predecessor organization, the New York Power Pool, was created in the wake of the 1965 Northeast electrical blackout. The Power Pool was formed by utilities and state government to coordinate power flows across New York and avoid the kind of large-scale outages that can harm the health, safety, and welfare of New Yorkers. And while the New York ISO holds the added responsibility of overseeing the competitive electric markets, our mission and job one will always be rooted in reliability of the electric system. That means effectively controlling the flow of energy generation to meet demand, while also planning for future system needs and ensuring enough energy reserves are available to meet unexpected system changes.
Do we have enough on the system in our assessment to keep the lights on in the future? What we've identified recently is that there is a little bit more of a risk there. We've enjoyed a surplus of power for many decades here in New York, and as we see those margins thin, it becomes a question of, well, what level of excess do we need on the system? What level of excess do we want on the system?
New York's move to decarbonize the electric system is having profound impacts on the way we manage the grid, now and into the future. The state's energy policy includes phasing out fossil fuel generation in favor of clean energy resources like wind, solar, and battery storage. Because these clean energy resources do not offer the same performance and reliability characteristics as the generation they are replacing, we need to plan and proceed with this transition of the electric system carefully to maintain the kind of reliability our economy and our society depends upon.
So this work is particularly complex and complicated for the New York ISO in particular, where there are very clear and forward-leaning goals to remove gas from the energy mix. However, we can have a bit of a disconnect if that work is not carried out and that transition is not done thoughtfully, carefully, and taking into account the very practical and realistic evolution that must occur.
On August 14, 2003, a transmission line fault in Ohio, caused by contact with a tree, cascaded into what would become one of the world's largest outages. At its worst, more than 50 million people in 8 states and Ontario lost power.
In literally a matter of probably 5 or 6 seconds, there was the lights flickered and then the lights went out. Started a more than a 24-hour effort to get the lights back in New York. And our operators tried to use our standard operating practices to restore the grid, but it's very difficult to do that because we don't have a lot of experience operating as an island. I think the big takeaways are it's hard to black start a system. We're all part of this giant grid. You really need to try to preserve the grid as much as you can before you suffer some major event.
Since 2003, grid operators have improved training, built smarter software, and installed protective equipment to prepare for and help avoid similar scenarios like the one that began in Ohio and impacted us here in New York. We've also improved communication with energy suppliers and utilities, while regulators have created more stringent reliability rules. But some factors, like catastrophic weather-related events, are beyond human control.
The ISO has historically been terrific at managing the grid, even through severe weather events and acts of God.
On October 29, 2012, New York suffered another large-scale outage when Hurricane Sandy hit the New York coast. The storm's tidal surge quickly grew to record levels, flooding lower Manhattan and causing severe damage to electric infrastructure, while many areas of Long Island were impacted as well.
It turned out to be almost a 3-day restoration event, just trying to restore the system. What was unexpected was the level of the tidal surge. Certainly we all saw the flooding in New York City area, the Battery Park and Long Island. What was unexpected was the loss of the transmission. Every 20 or 30 minutes, the tide would go up and there would be a loss of some other major transmission substation or generation.
Lessons learned following Sandy resulted in more reliability improvements to the grid, including hardening of electric infrastructure that was at risk from storm damage. In the future, one of the biggest risks to reliability may be from increased intermittency on the system. As the grid increasingly gets its electricity from solar or wind power, what happens when high energy demand days coincide with periods when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining? How can we help avoid the risk of power outages in the future?
When we look at what's happening in other states like Texas and California, I mean, what we see is, an abundance of other resources that are intermittent and also extreme weather situations and generator outages and the confluence of all of these things. When you have a reliance on all of these things and then in turn you have multiple failures, I mean, that is exactly what we're worried about of what if that happened in New York.
By keeping reliability in mind as we work together to transition the system to clean energy, keeping enough controllable and flexible resources online to fill in gaps when solar and wind power is not sufficient to meet customer needs. In time, new types of clean energy resources may fill that gap.
Now, I'm very confident both in our plans and in our market signals to send the right signals and to establish the right rules such that I think New York is very well positioned to have a reliable grid going forward. But it really does take that forward thinking and that forward sight to look at what are the risks on the grid, get out ahead of them, be planning the system accordingly, and be sending the right market signals to incentivize the right investments on the grid to prepare ourselves.
But for now, the transition to the grid of the future needs to be carefully managed. As extensively as we plan for the future, unexpected conditions arise. Responding to those situations requires having the right tools and resources in place when needed. For now and during this transition, that includes fossil fuel generators, until clean energy technologies can replace the reliability that they bring.